Today we're going to be talking about a very tragic accident that occurred over the Irish Sea, Aer Lingus Flight 712. If there is a country we don't get to talk about all too often on this channel, it's Ireland. Ireland's aviation safety record is very admirable. The small country in northwest Europe in the last half-century has only ever seen one fatal plane crash, and it didn't even involve an Irish airline. Before this period, however, Ireland suffered its fair share of air accidents, as with many nations adjusting to the new age of passenger air travel. Ireland's deadliest air disaster occurred on March 24, 1968. Aer Lingus Flight 712 is certainly interesting as the cause of the accident was never fully determined, and is a perfect case study of an accident in that category, and how a small country which had just suffered such a horrifying loss deals with that. When discussing this disaster, we naturally have to tread into the uneasy territory of theoretical possibilities and speculation. One theory even brings up uncomfortable questions about what Ireland's neighbour was doing that day. Let's examine the possibilities and see if we can shed some light on the mystery of Flight 712. Let's break down some preliminary information. Aer Lingus is the national air carrier of Ireland. Naturally, their base of operations are in Dublin, but our deeper look at this accident takes us to Cork. Flight 712 was, and even still is, the flight between Cork and London Heathrow. It's a popular route that Aer Lingus still operates today with the same flight number. At the time, the Irish operator employed a 4-engine propeller plane called a Vickers Viscount. Built in the United Kingdom, the Vickers Viscount was certainly a product of its time. It's a very old plane. Even in 1968, the Viscount was old. Launched in 1948, 445 of them were built across a few different variants, and Aer Lingus operated multiple of them, so they were an experienced operator of the type. By the time of the Aer Lingus disaster, the Viscount had already been out of production for a number of years, and the Irish carrier was trending towards modernizing the fleet. In fact, the older Viscounts had already been retired by 1968. Given the time period the Viscount operated in, there were a lot of plane crashes involving this plane. Get this, nearly a third of all Viscounts that were ever produced either crashed or were lost by other means. A number of those accidents involved the planes in question breaking apart in flight. Some of this could be put down to just the time period the plane existed in, where the aviation industry knew less than it knows today about flying. A lot of Viscounts ended up in the hands of small operators in developing countries, with less experience and less stringent maintenance. Aer Lingus, however, was, and really still is, a well-respected airline with a good safety record. March 24, 1968. It was a Sunday. In fact, it was Mother's Day in Ireland. 2 pilots turned up for work to take this Viscount to London. 35-year-old Captain Bernard O'Byrne had been flying with Aer Lingus for 12 years. With over 6,500 flight hours to his name, he not only flew Viscounts, but was also known to fly the new Boeing jet planes of the time. But in the days preceding the accident, he had been making hops out of Cork, flying between Ireland and the United Kingdom. The co-pilot that day was First Officer Paul Heffernan. He was just 22 years old. He did his flight training in the UK but moved over to Aer Lingus 2 years before the accident in 1966. His flight hours amounted to just over 1,100 in total. The first officer wasn't the only one to join Aer Lingus in 1966. The accident plane itself had been sold to the airline from the Dutch carrier KLM that year. When it arrived in Ireland, Aer Lingus named the aircraft the St. Phelim, and it already had over 10 years of flights behind it by that time. The flight between Cork and London that day would have been the plane's 14,665th flight. At 10:32 in the morning on March 24, 1968, Aer Lingus Flight 712 left Cork with 61 people on board. Shortly after takeoff, the pilots made for an easterly heading, flying along the southern coastal regions of Ireland to climb up to their cruising altitude of 17,000 feet. At 10:38, the flight received clearance to fly to their waypoint near to the corner of County Wexford. 2 minutes later, at 10:40, air traffic control came on the radios again to ask if the pilots would like to take a slightly quicker route across the Irish Sea by flying straight to their waypoint at Fishguard in Wales. The accident reports suggest that the pilots wouldn't take this change to their flight plan, but it's likely that it was discussed. Flight 712 continued flying along just south of the Irish coast, out over the water, and they reported their position at Bannow Bay at 10:57. In this message, they announced that they had reached 17,000 feet. Irish Air Traffic Control handed the plane off to controllers in London, with nothing to suggest that anything was out of the ordinary. The pilots acknowledged the handoff as normal and tuned their radios into the London frequency. In that small gap of communication was when disaster struck, before they even had a moment to transmit their first message to London. At 10:58, less than 1 minute after conversing with Irish ATC for the final time, controllers in London picked up what appeared to be a scrambled message on the radios emanating from the Irish Sea. This message was later confirmed to be Flight 712 transmitting the following message. Echo India Alpha Oscar Mike, with you, the plane's call sign, followed 8 seconds later by this unsettling message. 12,000 feet, descending, spinning rapidly. This was the final radio communication from the plane. Those listening initially interpreted the 12 in this message as 5, but it was later revealed that the word 12 was more likely correct. This was a radio message also heard by other aircraft in the area. An Aer Lingus flight between Dublin and Bristol had also heard the message and relayed information pertaining to the distressed aircraft back to the ground in Ireland. Whatever happened to the aircraft, it occurred suddenly, without warning, left the plane seemingly uncontrollable, and caused a significant drop in altitude of about 5,000 feet in a time span of seconds. Multiple attempts to contact the stricken aircraft proved fruitless. That Bristol-bound flight would soon receive instructions to perform a search operation to look for the plane. What is perhaps incredible is that by this point, the plane actually hadn't crashed yet. In fact, if we rewind to when this message was transmitted, the plane continued to fly, albeit in a heavily wounded state. The pilots would regain some control of the aircraft and would remain in the air for some time, one source stating around 10 minutes, whereas others suggesting the plane was in the air for up to 30 minutes. In that time, the Viscount would make a turn to a northerly heading before crashing into the Irish Sea a few miles away from Tuskar Rock, a tiny island home to a lighthouse. All 61 people on board Flight 712 were killed. A number of people claimed to have seen the plane going into the water. Irish and British vessels would begin a search and rescue operation only to discover that there were no survivors. Although some wreckage was spotted and even some washed onto the Irish coast, the main bulk of the wreckage would remain undiscovered for weeks. The British Royal Navy was criticised for poor search efforts, because as the weeks turned to months, after nearly 70 days, there was no main wreckage found. Despite locals pointing in the direction where the plane crashed, the Royal Navy failed to adequately search these areas. An Irish fisherman went looking himself and found the wreckage on his first outing. So now we've reached the point where we must rewind and see if we can shed some light on what had actually happened to the plane. As the deadliest air disaster to have ever occurred in Ireland, news of the Tuskar rock disaster quickly spread and consumed the entire nation of Ireland. Everyone wanted to know what happened to this plane. The plane's sudden disappearance, coupled with the lack of wreckage or any evidence, led to people piecing together their own theories. It didn't help that the plane was not equipped with any kind of flight recorder, so that's no flight data recorder or cockpit voice recorder, not even the older tape and foil devices. Naturally, this only fueled the mystery element of the disaster. There were even reports that the relatives of the deceased pilots were harassed in public as people began pointing fingers, some blaming the flight crew. Let's just quickly go over the conclusion of the first investigative report as a sort of jumping off point. It was released 2 years after the accident and was at the forefront of much controversy. To skip to the conclusion and findings of that report, quote, "There is not enough evidence available on which to reach a conclusion of reasonable probability as to the initial cause of this accident. The probable cause of the final impact with the sea was impairment of the controllability of the aircraft in the fore and aft pitching plane. Aer Lingus Flight 712 falls into the unfortunate category of air disasters where the cause was never fully determined, and remains so to this day. From this report and the reports that came thereafter, investigators had established that there was some kind of catastrophic failure in terms of controllability, specifying the plane's pitching controls. More precisely, the left side stabilizer. Irish reports would use the term tailplane in reference to the failure of this component. This is not to be confused with the tail fin, the vertical stabilizer. Tailplane is just another word used to describe the horizontal stabilizer. Just so we're all on the same page, the horizontal stabilizer, or tailplane, whatever you want to call it, refers to those smaller wings often seen at the aft end of airplanes. On the Viscount, tabs called elevators deflect up and down, and this controls the pitch, much like most other planes. The problem with the investigation into the Aer Lingus disaster is that though a problem occurred with the left side horizontal stabilizer, which no one appeared to dispute, there was little exploration into how that failure actually occurred, or which part of the stabilizer assembly was the problem, which were the answers that people really wanted. To reiterate, the official cause of the crash has remained undetermined, with the vague assertion that structural failure was at play. Criticism was leveled at the investigation, as the lead investigator had actually certified the accident plane's airworthiness, leading to a potential conflict of interest to many. Not to mention that Aer Lingus at the time was a state-owned air carrier, and the Irish government therefore had a vested interest in the success of the company, leading some to believe that the investigation was in some way influenced or swayed by the Irish government. So for a lot of people, a lot of questions were left unanswered. So to go back a bit, what are the theories and what is the evidence? From what we've discussed so far, we can ascertain that the starting point of the disaster struck in this region of the coast of southeastern Ireland. When the plane crashed here, it was completely obliterated. Some of the plane's wreckage was recovered and partly reconstructed to assist investigators. Despite the destruction of the aircraft, a significant section of the fuselage did exist and was found in the weeks after. There was, however, major difficulties in retrieving this large piece of wreckage. Following one failed attempt to lift it out the water, this section of fuselage, which included the nose and cockpit, was left at the bottom of the sea, where it still lays to this day. According to one source, it apparently broke apart during salvaging. The potentially important evidence and numerous bodies of the deceased stayed in the sea along with most of the aircraft. In fact, most of the bodies were never recovered. Only 14 of 61 were ever brought to surface. Let's have a quick chat about the airline, Aer Lingus. Despite Aer Lingus's positive perceived safety record, the truth about the airline at the time was somewhat plastered over. 2 other hull losses of Aer Lingus Viscounts had occurred in the previous year, including a fatal accident on a training flight that killed 3 people, and another non-fatal accident that occurred in Bristol. So to highlight, that is 3 losses of Viscounts from a single airline in a 365-day period. As mentioned earlier in this video, the Viscount was an old plane, even in 1968. The aircraft was already out of production. Could fatigue of the airframe have played a role in the disaster? If something broke off it in flight, it could explain how the pilots lost control of their plane. The loss of part or all of the horizontal stabilizer, for example, could have resulted in the sudden drop of altitude that is believed to have occurred. Let's go back to the map, because this is where things start to get interesting. Shortly after the accident, people started to come forward. Witnesses. These people around 15 miles away from Tuskar Rock, on the southern coast of County Wexford, came forward with the curious observation that some other object came down near the Saltee Islands, nowhere near where the plane ended up. This does line up with where the problem may have first began, before leaving the plane uncontrollable until it crashed. The accounts from those eyewitnesses couldn't specify exactly what that object was. Some suggested it was a piece of debris, others saying it was another aircraft. Regardless, dozens of people came forward with the same story. An object fell out of the sky and splashed into the water nearby to the Saltee Islands. To this day, no one knows what this mystery object was, and it was never found. As you'd might expect, a mysterious object falling out of the sky was prone to some speculation, and given how investigators came to a dead end and the similarity in dozens of accounts that day, these needed to be considered. Obviously, some have suggested that it could have been a critical part of the Aer Lingus plane. The tail vertical stabilizer was recovered, and was found along with the main section of wreckage at Tuskar Rock, eliminating the idea of the tail section breaking away. However, according to reports, including a revised report released in 2000, whilst sections of the elevator spring tab, that is these outer parts of the stabilizer structure highlighted here, were found, the elevators and the fixed horizontal stabilizer sections weren't found at all. Some have attributed the find of one fragment of the elevator spring tab being found washed up on the beach near to the town of Rosslare to be evidence that a failure or breaking of the elevators had occurred in flight. Damage analysis of the recovered wreckage they did have could only reveal that the damage done to the plane was done on impact with the water. There is no evidence or indication that such breaking happened. Not enough wreckage could be found, and of the wreckage that was found, no conclusive evidence could be obtained, which didn't really help much with the investigation. What all of this was able to tell investigators was the probable way the plane crashed. It is believed to have went down into the sea at a shallow angle, with moderate speed and considerable downward vertical speed. The plane did not plummet straight down into the sea, and the fuselage did not break in flight. But what can cause such thing to occur? Part of the plane just breaking off? If the accident was a result of, say, a poorly maintained plane, this then certainly was not an isolated incident. Similarities were drawn between this accident and multiple others, one investigator pointing towards an accident involving a Viscount that would occur in 1980 in Indonesia. 37 people were killed in an accident that Indonesian investigators attributed to a failure of the elevator spring tab specifically, the same piece that washed ashore in Ireland. Although bits falling off an aircraft was not something exclusive to just the Vickers Viscount, perhaps indicative of a larger problem within aviation when these planes were constructed. Take, for example, the accident of Air Flight 394, where more parallels can be drawn. This was a plane crash involving an aircraft of similar age to the Aer Lingus Viscount and built in the same era, albeit from a different manufacturer. Off the coast of Denmark at cruise altitude, the pilots suddenly lost control of their plane before crashing into the sea, killing 55 people. This accident, which occurred much later in 1989, was found to have been caused by a structural failure of the rudder this time, induced by poor maintenance and use of inadequate and counterfeit aircraft parts. So it is not unheard of, even in the years since the Irish disaster, for such accidents to occur. And if maintenance is an area to analyze when looking at Flight 712, we should highlight the fact that some of Aer Lingus's own records regarding maintenance works of the accident plane seemed to disappear, or were found to be missing from their offices and were absent from the investigation. Those maintenance records of the plane have not been seen since. There are other theories about what that rogue object was that was observed falling into the sea. Speculations began to grow that there was a collision of some kind in the air, and perhaps the object that people saw was another aircraft. On the surface, though, this wouldn't make much sense. No other plane was reported missing that day. Support for this theory, though, did grow following an intriguing find a number of years later. In 1974, a trawler vessel stumbled across a large red metallic object in this region of the sea. When it was examined further, it bared the resemblance of an aircraft, but upon closer inspection, also looked nothing like what one would think of when you picture an airplane. It resembled a plane, but had no cockpit, no windows, and was painted bright red. What this object actually was a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle called a Jindivik. This obviously presents more questions than answers. What is this thing? Where did it come from? And did it have anything to do with the disaster at Tuskar Rock? So let's answer these three questions. A Jindivik is effectively a remote-controlled target drone. They originated half a world away in Australia and were used by the Australian Air Force and Navy as target practice. They can fly fast and even climb to altitudes exceeding 50,000 feet. Mimicking a fighter jet, these dummy planes were designed to be shot down. They were target drones. A number of these target drones found their way to the United Kingdom to be used for the same purposes by the British Royal Air Force. Okay, so you may be able to see what narrative began to emerge and where this perhaps might be going, and it does go a bit deeper. The Irish Sea, shared with both Britain and Ireland, has been used for a number of military exercises, even around that time in 1968, when the Aer Lingus accident occurred. Both the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy had been using the waters out here for training and, of course, target practice. When the British acquired these Jindivik planes, they launched them from their base in Llanbedr on the west coast of Wales. When the British military conducted their exercises in the Irish Sea, they did so within an exclusion zone that was mostly contained to Cardigan Bay. This zone, however, was still only a few minutes flying time away from the Irish coast. So for those who believed in the theory of a possible collision with a foreign object, the possibility that Aer Lingus Flight 712 could have collided with the Jindivik looked plausible. In fact, investigators throughout the years have had to consider this possibility, and it had been explored in official reports. A mid-air collision resulting in either impairment or separation of the flight control surfaces, that would explain it. Because the purpose of these Jindivik planes was for target practice, many also put forward the consideration that the Aer Lingus plane that day was mistaken for a Jindivik, which of course brings up a rather uncomfortable possibility. It is believed by some that Aer Lingus Flight 712 was inadvertently shot down by the British. You see, though the British military obtained these target drones from Australia for use with the Royal Air Force and Navy, what a lot of people really latched onto was who else was using them as well. Because what you'll also find on the western coast of Wales is a military base at the town of Aberporth. Jindivik planes were flown over the water and missiles were launched here to shoot them down in training missions. So of course, another narrative had formed that perhaps a stray missile could have hit the Viscount. Just like every other theory put forward in the investigations, the missile theory lacked the necessary conclusive evidence. This also goes for the Jindivik theory, because there is a problem with British involvement in this story, a discrepancy of time that doesn't line up and clouds the plausibility of these theories. The Tuskar Rock disaster occurred on a Sunday. No Jindiviks were ever launched on Sundays. It was confirmed that none of these planes were in the air that day, and no one was firing missiles into the sky either. If there was military activity in the region, the relevant aviation authorities would have been notified, as they had been on other occasions, and what is called a Notice to Airmen or NOTAM would have been issued. When Captain Bernard O'Byrne and First Officer Paul Heffernan turned up for work that day, they would have reviewed their flight plan and looked over any relevant NOTAMs. Analysis of the wreckage of the Jindivik found off the Irish coast in 1974 dated the UAV to have been in the sea for no more than 1 year, quashing speculations that it had anything to do with Flight 712. For many in Ireland, including the relatives of the deceased and investigators, this was enough for many people to say that it was unlikely that Flight 712 collided with a foreign object or was downed by a missile. The theory still persists, as apparently there are inconsistencies, as one source puts it, in the logbooks of some of the British warships that had been in the region. The British Ministry of Defence also had to admit that some documentation of the whereabouts of their ships had seemed to disappear. Though many different theories have sprung up about what exactly happened to the plane, after multiple reports and independent investigations as the years have gone by, people have tended to gravitate towards maintenance defects and poor airworthiness of the plane being at fault, a lot of criticism being directed towards Aer Lingus's poor record-keeping of maintenance. Aer Lingus for many years had wanted to upgrade its fleet, and the Viscounts were finally retired in 1973. Over the decades, Aer Lingus became a highly reputable airline and one of the safest in the entire world. There has never been a hull loss of an Aer Lingus aircraft since. Aviation safety in Ireland has improved substantially. The deadliest air accident to occur since was the crash of Manx 2 Flight 7100, which also happened to involve Cork. That accident killed 6 people. Tuskar Rock has never been forgotten in the country. A memorial has been set up and services still take place for those who perished that day. It is usually the standard convention that an airline would change the flight number where there has been a high-profile accident. Aer Lingus, however, still operates the Cork to London route, albeit with an Airbus A320 these days, and still retains the flight number 712. It never changed. Naturally though, and it is important to understand, that a lot of people have been left disappointed that this case has been left unsolved for so long. Successive Irish governments and even the little assistance from the United Kingdom have failed to retrieve more wreckage and conclusive answers. Perhaps the clues as to what really happened still lie at the bottom of the Irish Sea. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting. I know I found the topic interesting to research. There was so much to go over in this video. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to be subscribed, as there is always a new video every Saturday. We all like longer videos, and I actually do have an even bigger video planned at some point. Still not sure when that one will be released, but that one might actually be over 1 hour in length. I'll let you know more about that when it gets closer to fruition. Anyway, I want to take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on my Patreon for their amazing ongoing support. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Shout out this week to Confused Chicken, who pledged at the highest tier last week, an absolute legend. Thank you so much. If you yourself want to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 2 days before it goes out publicly on YouTube. Patrons got access to this video, for example, on Thursday. If you are a patron and you want to connect with me, you can always message me on there anytime. Outside of that, there is always my personal Twitter page, which will also be linked in the pinned comment below. That is it from me this week. I'll be diving back into producing the next video now, so thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Goodbye.